Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Hello, and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast about the most violent, unexplainable, and gut-wrenching events in Nashville's 200-year history. This episode relates to Nashville's glittery, glimmery, gilded past. Long before it was the it city, Nashville was a town on the decline, living on the remnants of its long-celebrated reputation as country music's home. One place in particular unabashedly symbolized the city's gaudy success and excess. It was called Skull's Rainbow Room, and it was the site of one of Nashville's most infamous murders. And that, my friends, is where we will pick up for this episode of Music City Murder. We're going to start with a brief history of a famous, some might say infamous, area of downtown Nashville. The terrain nestled between 3rd and 4th Avenues emerged as a major site for printing and publishing in the 1830s, eventually being christened Printer's Alley for housing 2 newspapers, the Tennessean and the Nashville Banner, as well as 10 printing shops and 13 publishers. Don't let the upstanding sounding name fool you, though. Printer's Alley was also ostensibly the city's red light district, frequently home to the city's more idiosyncratic endeavors. Cherry Street, now 4th Street, became devoted almost exclusively to men's needs, playing host to a whole bevy of saloons, billiard halls, restaurants, tobacconists, barbershops, and bathhouses. Oh, and there was a brothel called, not very subtly, the Climax Saloon, famous for its particular services in the late 1800s. In 1909, following an infamous downtown shootout, which I will definitely cover in a later episode, a partial statewide prohibition became law in Tennessee, banning the sale of liquor within 4 miles of a school, and eventually the manufacture of intoxicating beverages altogether. As a result, the saloons had to go underground and transform into secretive speakeasies, serving drinks on the down low as the state cracked down on the sale of wine and spirits. Over time, the speakeasies developed into evening clubs and nightclubs featuring music and contraband drinks. And those nightclubs would set the stage, so to speak, for the legendary honky-tonks that would make Nashville famous decades later. It is during this post-Prohibition transition in 1948 that a Nashville local named David Skull Schulman opens the Rainbow Room, a restaurant and burlesque joint right in the middle of Printer's Alley. And just for background information, he received the nickname not for being scary or threatening, but because he fractured his skull in an automobile accident. Almost immediately, the Rainbow Room becomes a destination for tourists and celebrities alike. To quote one article I read, later frequented by Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash, this 4,000 square foot space became a strip club, jazz hall, and speakeasy. Etta James, Patsy Cline, Paul McCartney, and Bob Dylan also appeared upon the Rainbow Room's checkerboard stage. At one point, Andy Griffith, the sheriff of Mayberry himself, holds court as the house comedian at the Rainbow Room. Skull, being a devout fan of country music, connects with all the stars of country music and beyond. His friendship with stars like Loretta Lynn and Willie Nelson, and his love and fandom for country music, leads to a stint as a semi-permanent honorary cast member of the TV show Hee Haw. The unelected mayor of Printers Alley, Skull gains notoriety as a sort of local attraction all his own. He can be found most days walking his dyed poodles on rhinestone leashes along the streets of downtown Nashville, clad in his denim Hee Haw overalls, or dropping in for a shave and a haircut before being taxied over to open up the Rainbow Room. And speaking of his poodles, Skull was so famous for the animals that he was once gifted one of the animals by Elvis Presley himself. And Presley suggested that he always name the dogs Sweetie or Sugar. On top of that, Schulman is credited for being extremely generous to the poor and the destitute who populated downtown Nashville. He often gives them the occasional odd job or cash outright when provided the opportunity. This is all to say that Skull was a beloved and unique figure among both the vagabonds and the elite of Nashville's most famous back alley. On January 21st, 1998, at around 6 o'clock p.m., a cigarette vendor named William Jones arrives at the Rainbow Room to find Sweetie the poodle, at least the most recent iteration, wandering around the bar. But not Schulman himself. You see, Skull could almost always be found at a usual spot within the establishment, and Jones is immediately perturbed by the absence. A few moments later, the vendor finds Skull lying in a heap on the ground. He had been hit over the head, fracturing his skull, and his throat had been viciously slashed. Paramedics and police arrive at 6:20 p.m., and they transport Schulman to a hospital. I couldn't find any information on which hospital it was, but I imagine it was probably St. Thomas Midtown on Charlotte. Country singer and close friend Tanya Tucker rushes to Skull's bedside to comfort him before he dies the next morning. Despite its slightly naughty reputation, Printers Alley is actually a fairly safe location. That's one of the reasons this case itself is so interesting. In fact, on a segment of America's Most Wanted about the murder, Detective Al Gray of the Metro Nashville Police Department claims that it's the first known murder in Printers Alley. And at the time of his death, Skull Schulman had been a fixture in the hustle and bustle of Nashville's nightlife for exactly 50 years. And he was 80 years old at the time of his passing. The investigation into Skull's murder gets off on the wrong foot almost immediately. Evidence at the Rainbow Room is scant, and the paramedics incidentally disturb the scene while moving the bar owner's body for transport. Only 17 fingerprints themselves are retrieved. Blood samples are collected from a towel found in the ladies' bathroom, and the blood is eventually determined to belong to Schulman. None of the bottles behind the bar are tested for prints, and neither is the cash register. At the conclusion of the investigation of the premises, at least initially, no physical evidence is discovered to point to any particular subject or suspect. Dr. John Garber, an assistant medical examiner, performs the autopsy on David Schulman. The cause of death is listed as multiple incised wounds to the neck and blunt force trauma to the head. Skull's throat had been slit in 3 different places. But even though he lost a significant amount of blood, the knife wounds are superficial and would not by themselves have resulted in death, with some medical attention, of course. In addition to the knife wounds, however, the victim suffered a subgaleal hemorrhage on the left side of his head caused by a blow from a blunt instrument. With the autopsy, Dr. Gerber is incapable of specifying either the type of knife or the kind of instrument used to bludgeon Mr. Schulman. Because of the circumstances of the crime, it generates immediate press attention, and a few months later, America's Most Wanted does a segment on the murder. For the uninitiated, America's Most Wanted was a true crime show that spotlighted unsolved murders in order to find the killers. It wasn't just a show produced for ratings, although it did a hell of a business. It actually tried to do some public good. And the host, John Walsh, made it his personal mission to track down killers in unsolved cases for a very specific reason. His own son, 6-year-old Adam, had been abducted and murdered by serial killer Otis Toole in 1981, which had sparked John Walsh's commitment to justice wherever he could find it. Following the episode that aired on TV, Detective Al Gray receives a call from a woman named Beverly Sumner, a bartender at Legends Corner on Lower Broad in Nashville. She tells Gray that she got a bad feeling from 2 men who showed up at the bar shortly after the murder. One of them attempted to change his appearance while there, and the other was limping. Based on this interaction, Detective Gray locates a man named Jason Pence at the Nashville Library downtown. Pence admits to Gray that he had been with a man named James Cavay, that's Cavaye, that night, but says he did not know Mr. Schulman and had never been to Skull's Rainbow Room. He acknowledges that he changed his appearance by shaving and cutting his hair that night. But since he's not a suspect, the conversation is not recorded and Detective Gray goes about his business. A few weeks later, Gray interviews Pence again, but the only information he receives is that Cavay sometimes stays at the Union Mission in Nashville, since both men are functionally experience homelessness. Detective Gray contacts the mission and obtains Cavay's mother's telephone number in Oregon, all the way across the country. The woman informs the detective that her son had been in Oregon, but is now in Florida. She also confirms the fact that he was limping when he visited the family right after Schulman's murder. In November 1999, Detective E.J. Bernard is assigned as lead detective on the case. Up until that time, police had been operating under the assumption that the victim had died from knife wounds, not the wound to his head. In late November, however, Detective Bernard learns that head trauma had been the real cause of death. Based on information from a man named Jules Tabor, who also worked at Legends Corner, Detective Bernard begins to search for Jason Pence in earnest. Tabor had basically copped to the same story as Beverly Sumner, stating that Pence and Cavay came into Legends looking disheveled and covered in blood. Cavay claims that he had been in a fight as a bouncer at the Turf, it's a bar, and had gotten bloodied as a result. Now, the Turf was a honky-tonk in downtown Nashville that has been replaced by Rippy's, for those who are wondering. Unfortunately for Cavay, Kathleen Moore, owner of the Turf at the time of the murder, states unequivocally that the club never employs bouncers. Eventually, Detective Bernard finally locates Jason Pence at a mental health facility in Lincoln, Nebraska. Pence admits to Bernard that he does remember seeing Cavay covered in blood the morning after the murder. He tells the detective that Cavay admitted to killing Mr. Schulman over coffee at Legends. Detective Bernard returns to Nashville and interviews a man named Don Link. Don Link is the manager of the Burger King on 4th Avenue downtown. The restaurant's back door opens to Printer's Alley, and Mr. Link had told detectives that he had noticed 2 white men standing by the elevators in the garage across from the Rainbow Room. As manager, he had a nightly routine of moving his car from the top floor of the garage to the bottom level for security purposes. He was in his car, and when his lights illuminated the 2 men, they fled up the stairs of the garage to the next floor. Don Link immediately identifies Jason Pence as one of the men he had seen the night of the murder. Bernard returns to Nebraska to interview Pence, and this time Pence admits his involvement in the robbery, stating further that he knew Skull Schulman from working for him in 1996 as a maintenance man. He also states that he and Cavey had planned the robbery in the parking garage across from the Rainbow Room, the one where Don Link had seen them. However, he says he stayed at the front door as a lookout as James Cavey went inside to commit the robbery. Pence continues confessing, telling Bernard that he heard a struggle from within, but did not witness the confrontation. This should come as no surprise, but at this point, Jason Pence is arrested and transported back to Nashville. It should also be noted at this point the irony of two drifters murdering Skull Schulman, since he was often so kind to people experiencing homelessness in Nashville, those down on their luck, because that ends up being sort of an end for him. On February 9th, 2000, Jason Pence changes his story and confesses that he had been present when Cavey assaulted and robbed the victim. Detective Bernard receives information from Cavey's father that his son is in San Francisco. After the San Francisco police apprehend James Cavey, Detective Bernard interviews him. Following this initial meeting, Bernard returns to Nashville, and Don Link, the Burger King manager, identifies James Cavey as the second man from the garage in the photographic lineup. Cavey is then placed under arrest and transported back to Nashville as well. During the trial, the picture of what actually happened that afternoon in Skull's Rainbow Room becomes a little more clear. Jason Pence testifies that the following events occurred with regard to the murder of David Schulman. Prior to the murder, Pence knew the victim because he used to clean the Rainbow Room back in 1996. 5 or 6 days before the murder, both he and Cavey decided to rob someone because they were tired of being homeless. Pence testified that it was his idea to rob the victim because he knew that Schulman carried cash in the pockets of his bib overalls. This is an interesting development, at least for me, as a side story, because if you go back to our first 2 episodes with the murder of String Bean from Hee Haw also, that murder also occurred because String Bean, the banjo player, kept cash hidden in his Hee Haw bib overalls. Go back to listen to those first 2 episodes to find out more about that story. On the day of the murder, Cavey and Pence met again around 5 p.m. to discuss the robbery in a parking garage across from the Rainbow Room. Cavey told Pence that he would beat up Skull Schulman if he did not give them the money, and the two left the garage for the nearby Rainbow Room. Initially, Pence stood by the doorway as a lookout because he was concerned that the victim would recognize him. However, he left his post because he wanted to see what Cavey was going to do. When Cavey asked the victim for money, Skull Schulman refused. Cavey then hit the victim twice in the face and 3 or 4 times in the stomach, knocking him off the bar stool and onto the floor. As the victim tried to rise, Cavey pulled his head back and placed a knife against his throat. Cavey asked for the money again, and when the victim again refused, he cut his throat 3 times and let him go. Cavey reached over and removed some money from the victim's pockets, then went into the bathroom and washed the blood off his hands. The victim cried out for help, and Cavey told Pence to shut him up. When Pence refused, Cavey hit the victim over the head with a liquor bottle, then placed the bottle back behind the bar. After that, the victim was quiet. Cavey took some money out of the cash register and closed the drawer. He and Pence then left the bar, agreeing to meet up later that night to split the money. Around 8:30 p.m., Cavey and Pence met at the Turf, the one that Cavey said he was a bouncer at. Cavey had blood on his jeans and shirt and was limping. He gave Pence $5 out of the $45 he had taken from the victim, saying that Pence had not acted as a lookout like he was supposed to do. Around midnight, the 2 men separated. Just want to point out quickly that David Schulman lost his life over $50. $50. The next morning, Pence spotted Cavey near Legends Corner as Pence headed to the Union Mission for breakfast. Cavey still had on the clothes he wore the night before, and the 2 of them went into Legends Corner so Cavey could wash. Penn saw Cavey for the last time 2 days later during a vigil held for the victim in Printer's Alley. He and Cavey, along with a friend and her 2 sons, attended the ceremony. While they were there, Cavey knelt down, made the sign of the cross, and sang Amazing Grace. Following that jury trial, James Charles Cavey was convicted of first-degree felony murder and especially aggravated robbery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder and to a consecutive sentence of 24 years for the especially aggravated robbery. He appealed the sentence a little bit later in 2002, but was denied that appeal, and as far as I know, is still in prison today. You know, one of the interesting things about this story is the lack of information around it. It is a pretty famous story surrounding a murder of a semi-famous character around Nashville, and there's almost no information online about it. I used mostly the core documents as the guiding. That's why this one is pretty straightforward as far as the facts go. But yeah, it was difficult to find a lot of information about it and an update on. I'm pretty sure Cavey's and James Cavey's in prison still, and I'm not sure about Jason Pence. I don't imagine that he's probably still in jail, but I also really struggled to find any information about him, even though I searched all over the internet. There is still a version of the America's Most Wanted clip online if you want to find it. I'll include it in the show notes, but it is an especially sad case because David Schulman's life was devoted to entertaining people, and apparently by all conclusions we can draw, he was really kind to people in need. And so it's just a really sad situation for someone who was so beloved. And if you can, there are plenty of pictures of Skull Schulman online with, Sugar and Sweetie. So you can find them online and look up David Schulman or Skull Schulman. It's SCHULMAN. Now, Skull's Rainbow Room closed about 6 months after Skull's murder and stayed closed for a long time, but was reopened in the mid-aughts, like 2014 or so, I guess aught-teens, and it's still open today. I'm actually thinking about making a reservation to go see the burlesque show and have dinner and experience what is truly a Nashville original. And so I'd encourage you to look it up as well. And if you're in town for any reason whatsoever, it is a hot tourist destination. Printer's Alley itself is still going strong and is seems a lot less seedy than it did when Skull opened the Rainbow Room back in 1948. So that's it for this episode of Music City Murder. I hope you found this case as interesting as I did, and if you like what you heard, make sure you go rate and review the podcast over on Apple Podcasts. Just give it 5 stars. Don't worry about what you have to say. Just say, the show's good. I like it. Because ultimately, I don't care about the ratings or the views, but they do help the show. True crime is something everyone gets interested in, but I'd like to carve out a niche for regional murder. Maybe not just Nashville, but Tennessee and the South in general. So if you like the show, go rate and review it, and tell your friends about it. If you like it, tell one friend about Music City Murder, especially someone who might be interested in Nashville, the Grand Ole Opry, or the like. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Music City Murder.